The Venator didn't fail. The Republic used it wrong. I see this argument everywhere in the comments, and here's the thing. It's absolutely correct. There needed to be screening ships. Purpose-built destroyers deploying ahead so fighters could hammer enemy capital ships. A layered fleet design where every vessel operates within its intended role. And the Republic? They never figured that out. So let's talk about the Venator-class Star Destroyer. Not its specs. Not a Wikipedia recitation of its weapon systems. We're going to prosecute a case. A case against Republic admirals who took one of the most sophisticated carrier designs in galactic military history and threw it into knife fights it was never meant to survive. The Venator was a talented employee blamed for management's failures. And today, we're setting the record straight. But first, and I need to address this directly because the correctors will eat me alive if I don't, let's clear up a common misconception. The ships at the First Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY? Those weren't Venators. Those were Acclamator-class transgalactic military assault ships. Different vessel entirely. The Acclamators descended through those dust clouds to deliver the Grand Army of the Republic, carrying approximately 16,000 clone troopers and their combat vehicles to the planet's surface. The Acclamator was fundamentally a troop transport, a flying armored box designed to get soldiers planetside while providing orbital fire support. The Venator came later, approximately 30 months after Geonosis, to be precise. See, the Republic Navy was built essentially from nothing in the months following that battle. No institutional memory, no established fleet doctrine, no officer corps trained in large-scale naval operations. They were learning warfare in real time, and the Venator was rushed into service to meet a desperate need. The separatist aerospace threat was tearing Republic forces apart, and the Acclamator's limited fighter complement couldn't answer it. So Kuat drive yards delivered their solution. And what a solution it was. The Venator-class Star Destroyer represented the work of Lyra Wessex, one of the most brilliant naval architects in galactic history. Her mandate wasn't to build a warship that could slug it out with separatist frigates. Her mandate was to create a vessel capable of projecting starfighter dominance across entire star systems. Every single design decision she made pointed toward that singular purpose. Look at the ship itself. The most distinctive feature isn't the weapons or the armor. It's the massive dorsal hangar bay that runs nearly the entire length of the upper hull. When those armored doors retract, they reveal a flight deck of unprecedented scale. This isn't a secondary feature. This isn't a nice-to-have. Wessex and her team essentially built a ship around the largest possible hangar bay they could engineer, then added weapons and armor as secondary considerations. 59 million credits per hull. That's what Kuat drive yards invested in each 1,137-meter frame. The fighter complement alone tells you everything. 420 combat spacecraft. V-19 Torrent interceptors for aerospace superiority. ARC-170 heavy fighters for long-range strike operations. BTLBY wing bombers for anti-capital ship attacks. Later, Eta-2 Actis-class interceptors favored by Jedi pilots. 420 starfighters. That's more aerospace power than some planetary defense networks. A single Venator operating at full capacity could establish dominance over an entire theater of operations. The 7,400 crew personnel reflected the complexity of carrier operations. Flight deck crews, maintenance technicians, traffic controllers, munitions handlers, all the people required to coordinate hundreds of individual spacecraft and their pilots. An additional capacity for 2,000 troops provided organic ground assault capability, but this was clearly secondary to the vessel's primary aerospace mission. The Venator was born to be a carrier, period. So what went wrong? The armament tells part of the story. 8 heavy dual turbolaser turrets, 2 medium dual turbolaser cannons, 52 point defense laser cannons, 4 heavy proton torpedo tubes. Meaningful firepower, sure, but firepower calibrated for self-defense and support operations. These weapons could discourage light raiding forces, They could suppress planetary targets during orbital assault. They could provide defensive fire against incoming fighters and missiles. They were adequate for a carrier operating within its intended tactical envelope. They were entirely insufficient for capital ship duels. But that's exactly what Republic admirals kept demanding of them. This is where we need to talk about doctrine. Real doctrine. The kind of fleet thinking that transforms individual ships into coordinated fighting systems. Because the Republic had the conceptual framework available to make the Venator devastatingly effective, and they never implemented it. Here's how carrier operations are supposed to work. A fleet deploys in layers. Screening vessels form the forward line. These are your brawlers, ships designed to engage threats directly, absorb punishment, and create operational space behind them. The screen takes the hits. The screen trades fire. The screen fixes the enemy in position. Carriers operate in that protected space, safe from enemy capital weapons. Their job isn't to fight ship to ship. Their job is to launch. The screens engage. The carriers launch. The fighters destroy. This isn't theoretical abstraction. This is proven tactical methodology that goes back to wet Navy operations on 1,000 worlds. Carrier task forces work because the carrier never has to defend itself. Dedicated screening ships handle threats before they can endanger the vulnerable flight deck. The carrier stays back, protected, coordinating the real killing power, its aerospace wing. And this is exactly where the Republic failed the Venator. The Victory-class Star Destroyer existed during the Clone Wars, a 900-meter warship purpose-built for capital ship combat, faster than the Venator in practical maneuver, more heavily armored for close engagement, an armament optimized for ship-to-ship warfare. This was the screening ship the Venator needed, a doctrine where Victory-class destroyers formed the battle line, while Venator-class carriers hung back and launched devastating fighter strikes could have transformed the Republic's strategic position. But by the time victories arrived in significant numbers, the doctrinal damage was done. Republic admirals had spent years treating Venators as frontline brawlers. The habits were set. The losses had already mounted. The screening ships came too late. The doctrine never came at all. Let me show you what this looked like in practice. And I want to start with two of the most famous Venators in the Clone Wars, the Resolute and the Negotiator. The Resolute served as Anakin Skywalker's flagship. Think about what that means for a moment. Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, the hero with no fear, a Jedi whose entire combat philosophy centered on aggressive action and personal initiative, was given command of a carrier, a ship designed to hang back and coordinate fighter operations. What do you think happened? The Resolute was consistently pushed into direct engagement. Anakin led from the front because that's who Anakin was. His carrier became a battering ram, absorbing fire that screening vessels should have taken, positioned where carriers should never be positioned. The ship survived numerous close-quarters engagements through a combination of skilled crew, force-sensitive command intuition, and sheer luck. But it was being used wrong every single time. When the Resolute was finally destroyed during the campaign to rescue Even Peel from the Citadel, it wasn't because the ship failed. It was destroyed by Separatist forces after being committed to yet another operation where the carrier served as primary combatant rather than aerospace coordinator. The Resolute died the way it lived, in the wrong place, doing the wrong job, following orders from a commander who didn't understand, or didn't care, what carriers were for. The Negotiator tells a similar story, with a slightly different ending. Obi-Wan Kenobi's flagship saw action across nearly every major campaign of the Clone Wars. Kenobi was more tactically cautious than Skywalker, more willing to think through operational considerations. But even he consistently deployed his carrier in positions that carrier doctrine would never permit. At the Battle of Coruscant, the Negotiator fought in the chaotic close-range melee to rescue Chancellor Palpatine, a carrier, in a knife fight, over the capital of galactic civilization. The ship took devastating damage it never should have suffered, damage that proper fleet positioning would have prevented entirely. These weren't isolated failures. They were systemic. Every major Jedi commander treated their Venator the same way, as a personal flagship that would lead from the front, projecting command presence through direct engagement. Noble, perhaps. Cinematically impressive, certainly. And tactically catastrophic for vessels designed around an entirely different operational concept. The early war demonstrated this pattern before habits calcified into doctrine. Consider the Malevolence campaign. The Separatists had deployed a Subjugator-class heavy cruiser, a massive vessel armed with ion cannons capable of disabling entire fleets at extreme range. Republic forces threw Venators at this problem, carriers pursuing a long-range weapon platform that could cripple them before they ever achieved fighter launch range. The tactical insanity of this approach should be obvious. The Malevolence's ion cannons created a range game the Venator couldn't win through direct pursuit. What the Republic needed was a screening force that could absorb the ion weapon's effects, while Venators stayed back, protected, launching bombers to circle around and strike the subjugator from unexpected vectors. Instead, Venators charged. Venators got disabled. Venators died. General Grievous destroyed multiple Republic battle groups during the Malevolence campaign, precisely because Republic commanders kept trying to solve a carrier problem with battleship tactics. They had the tools for an aerospace solution. They had Y-wing bombers capable of delivering killing strikes from beyond the ion cannon's effective range. They had the fighter complement to screen their own approach while bombers circled for attack runs. They used none of it, not systematically. The Shadow Squadron attack that eventually crippled the Malevolence succeeded because it finally employed proper aerospace tactics. Bombers approaching from an unexpected vector, using speed and maneuverability to avoid the ion weapon, delivering ordnance to a target that couldn't defend against that kind of attack. This should have been standard doctrine from day one. Instead, it took a series of devastating losses before anyone thought to use the Venator the way Lyra Wessex had designed it to be used. And even after that success, Republic Command learned nothing. The very next campaign saw Venators back in direct engagement roles, absorbing fire, trading turbo-laser salvos with Separatist frigates, dying in ways their designers never anticipated. The Confederacy of Independent Systems had built their fleet specifically for this kind of direct engagement. The Munificent-class Star frigate wasn't subtle about its purpose. At 825 meters, smaller than the Venator, but with devastating forward firepower. Twin heavy turbo-laser cannons, twin heavy ion cannons, 26 twin turbo-laser cannons, all concentrated in the forward arc. Point that thing at a target and pull the trigger. Simple, brutal, effective. More critically, munificents were cheap. The Confederacy could field multiple frigates for the cost of a single Venator. And they did exactly that. Naval records document engagements where single Venators absorbed the combined firepower of 8 Munificent-class frigates. 8. Even when Republic ships survived, and many didn't, they sustained damage requiring extensive yard time. Damage that proper fleet doctrine would have prevented entirely. The CIS also relied heavily on automated Vulture droid starfighters, expendable craft deployed in staggering numbers without concern for pilot casualties. A single Separatist carrier could launch hundreds of these things, creating swarms that overwhelmed defensive screens. Clone pilots flying superior Republic starfighters could defeat these swarms through skill, training, and organic judgment, but only if those pilots could be deployed in sufficient numbers from platforms that remained operational. When Venators got hammered in close-range capital ship duels, they couldn't launch effectively. When they couldn't launch, the CIS aerospace advantage became insurmountable. When aerospace dominance shifted to the Separatists, Republic ground operations suffered. The whole strategy unraveled because admirals kept pushing their carriers into battleship roles. Here's something that proves this wasn't a design limitation. It was a choice. The Tector-class Star Destroyer. Same basic hull as the Venator. Same Kuat drive yards engineering. Same 1,137-meter frame. But the Tector had one critical difference. The dorsal hangar was sealed up with additional armor plating. No flight deck. No fighter operations. Just a reinforced upper hull capable of absorbing punishment that would have gutted a standard Venator. The Tector was a Venator converted into a battleship. Think about what this means. The Republic, or at least someone within Republic procurement, understood that the Venator hull was sound. The problem was the dorsal hangar exposure. When those bay doors opened for launch operations, the ship became vulnerable. Turbolaser strikes into that open hangar could detonate fuel stores, armed munitions, parked starfighters, cascading secondary explosions gutting ships from within. So they built a variant with no hangar at all. The existence of the Tector class proves the entire thesis of this video. The hull wasn't the problem. The vulnerability wasn't inherent to Venator engineering. The vulnerability existed only because the Venator was being placed in situations where enemy capital ships could achieve firing solutions on its open flight deck, situations that proper carrier doctrine would have prevented. If the Republic had developed screening doctrine, they wouldn't have needed the Tector. Venators would have operated behind battle lines, launching fighters while escort vessels absorbed enemy fire. The dorsal hangar exposure would have been irrelevant, because no enemy capital ship would ever get close enough to exploit it. Instead, the Republic's answer to, "Our carriers are getting shot," was, "Build carriers that can't carry fighters." They solved the doctrinal problem with an engineering band-aid, and they still never learned the actual lesson. The final months of the Clone Wars demonstrated just how entrenched these failures had become. The Siege of Mandalore saw Ahsoka Tano commanding Republic forces in a major planetary assault. The naval component deployed Venators in standard Republic fashion, pushed forward, engaged directly, absorbing fire that screening vessels should have taken. By this point in the war, the Republic had been fighting for 3 years. 3 years to develop proper fleet doctrine. 3 years to study losses and adapt tactics. They were still using carriers as battleships. When Order 66 fell and the war ended, the Republic Navy's doctrinal failures became the Empire's inheritance. The new regime faced a choice about what to do with surviving Venator-class carriers. Their decision reveals everything about how doctrine shapes force structure, and what opportunities were lost in the transition. The Empire phased out the Venator in favor of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. From the Imperial perspective, this made philosophical sense. The Imperial class was a battleship in every meaning of the word. 1,600 meters of intimidating firepower, designed to dominate through sheer presence and overwhelming force. Where the Venator required screening and proper fleet coordination to achieve its potential, the Imperial class was the screen made manifest. A single vessel capable of handling most threats without support. Grand Moff Tarkin's doctrine of rule through fear demanded ships that projected terror. The Venator, for all its capabilities, looked like what it was: a carrier, a support vessel, a ship that implied coordination rather than domination. The Imperial class looked like a weapon, pointed, aggressive, terrifying. The Empire wanted simplicity. One ship, one solution. Point it at a problem and watch the problem disappear. Imperial starfighter doctrine shifted accordingly. Where the Republic had valued skilled clone pilots in capable spacecraft, treating fighters as precision instruments crewed by professionals worth protecting, the Empire adopted a grimmer calculus. TIE fighters were designed without shields or hyperdrives, cheap to produce in vast numbers. Their pilots? Treated as replaceable resources. Interchangeable parts in a machine of infinite scale. If fighters were expendable munitions rather than valuable assets, the strategic necessity for dedicated carrier platforms diminished. Imperial Star Destroyers carried TIE complements adequate for local superiority missions, and the Empire could afford to lose fighters and pilots at rates no enemy could match. The Venator class, designed around the opposite philosophy, carriers protecting valuable aerospace assets, no longer fit the Imperial model. So they retired them, scrapped them, relegated them to secondary duties and backwater assignments. A vessel designed to project starfighter dominance through careful doctrine was abandoned by a regime that chose to achieve dominance through mass and attrition instead. But here's where I want you to imagine something with me. What if the Empire had kept the Venator? Not as a frontline brawler, the Imperial class handled that role perfectly. What if they'd retained it in its proper function? Picture this fleet. Imperial-class Star Destroyers formed the battle line. Their firepower and resilience engage enemy capital ships directly. Those massive 1,600-meter wedge hulls absorb punishment that would cripple lesser vessels. They're the screen the Venator always needed, purpose-built battleships protecting the carrier behind them. And behind them, positioned exactly where carrier doctrine demands, Venator-class carriers open their dorsal bays. The Imperial class provides the protection. The Venator provides the aerospace superiority the Imperial class could never achieve with its limited TIE complement. Combined arms, layered fleet design, everything the Republic never figured out. The Rebel Alliance built its entire strategy around exploiting Imperial aerospace weaknesses. Think about that. Imperial Star Destroyers carried fighter complements adequate for patrol and interception, but insufficient for true carrier operations. The Death Star at Yavin died because its fighter screen couldn't stop a single squadron of X-Wings from reaching the exhaust port. 30 starfighters. That's all it took. The most powerful battle station in galactic history, destroyed because nobody could provide adequate aerospace denial. The Battle of Endor saw Rebel fighters penetrate Imperial formations because the fleet lacked the concentrated aerospace defense that carrier doctrine could have provided. A-Wings and X-Wings and B-Wings threading through TIE screens, reaching capital ships, delivering killing blows. An Imperial Navy incorporating Venator-class carriers in their proper role, launching 420 fighters per carrier in overwhelming numbers from protected positions behind Imperial-class screens. That presents the rebellion with a strategic problem potentially beyond their capacity to solve. Every Rebel strike would face waves of defenders before reaching a single Star Destroyer. Every X-Wing squadron would be swarmed and annihilated by aerospace forces operating under carrier coordination. Every desperate assault on Imperial installations would break against a wall of fighters deployed from vessels that actually had the hangar capacity to sustain prolonged aerospace operations. The combination of Imperial firepower and Republic-style aerospace superiority might have proven insurmountable. This combined fleet never materialized. The Republic had the carrier, but not the doctrine. The Empire developed a doctrine that could have used the carrier, but discarded the vessel for philosophical reasons. The Venator passed through two eras without either government understanding how to employ it correctly. Two successive galactic regimes. Neither figured it out. The Venator-class Star Destroyer stands guilty of nothing except being too specialized for commanders who didn't understand specialization. Lyra Wessex and her team at Kuat Drive Yards created exactly what the Republic needed. The massive dorsal hangar. The unprecedented fighter complement of 420 starfighters. The tactical coordination systems optimized for aerospace operations. Every feature performed precisely as designed. What the Venator couldn't do was compensate for admirals who pushed it into battleship roles, for fleet doctrine that never developed proper screening concepts, for military leadership, many of them Jedi who believed in leading from the front, who treated carriers as brawlers and expressed confusion when those carriers sustained losses they should never have faced. The Resolute died fighting like a battleship. The Negotiator was crippled fighting like a battleship. Across every major campaign of the Clone Wars, Venators were destroyed or damaged in roles their designers never intended them to fill. The Tector existed as proof that someone understood the problem and chose the wrong solution. The Victory class could have provided the screen. The doctrine was available to any commander willing to think about fleet operations as combined arms problems. The solution was obvious, historically validated, entirely within the Republic's reach. Instead, Venators charged forward into knife fights their designers never intended them to survive. They fought bravely. They fought well, within the limitations of their design. And they were blamed for the failures of the admirals who commanded them. Failures that proper doctrine would have prevented entirely. The Venator-class Star Destroyer deserved better than it received, from the Republic that built it and the Empire that discarded it. It was the carrier that could have been. The aerospace platform that could have defined an era. The ship that never found commanders worthy of its design. 59 million credits per hull. 420 fighters. 1,137 meters of carrier engineering built around a single purpose, projecting starfighter dominance across star systems. And nobody, not the Republic, not the Empire, ever bothered to use it correctly. What a waste. Subscribe for more stories like this.